The first sign that our quiet weekend at the lake was about to explode came while my wife was still brushing her teeth. I was making coffee, half awake, when her phone lit up with an urgent dispatch call. She put it on speaker, toothpaste still foaming at the corners of her mouth. "Ma'am, we've received a 911 report that a woman named Rachel Merritt is unlawfully occupying a residence at Lake Pine Estates. The complainant is requesting immediate removal." Rachel slowly turned her head toward me, eyes wide equal parts disbelief and amusement. "Honey," she said, spitting into the sink, "apparently I'm illegally living in our own house." And that's when I knew. Only one person in this entire community was unhinged enough to weaponize 911 like that. HOA President Karen, the self-appointed Queen of the Pines. And she had no idea she'd just tried to evict the woman who runs the state police force. Before I dive in, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And hey, if you love HOA chaos and sweet justice, don't forget to subscribe. If you've never watched your spouse, your calm, collected, borderline legendary spouse get falsely reported to 911 before breakfast, let me tell you, it's a special kind of surreal. One second you're sipping coffee, the next you're staring at your wife as she wipes toothpaste off her mouth and mutters, "She really called the cops on me?" But to understand why that moment wasn't actually a surprise, you need to know what happened 3 days earlier, because the truth is, Lake Pine Estates didn't suddenly become a battleground. The match had already been lit. Karen just finally decided to throw it into a pile of gasoline. We'd bought the cabin last spring after Rachel's promotion. I'm not exaggerating when I say she needed the break. When you run an entire state police force, you collect more stress than a discount pressure cooker. She never complained, not out loud, but I could see it on the long nights she couldn't sleep, on the mornings she stared at her uniform like it weighed 100 pounds. So, when the paperwork cleared, we packed the truck with groceries, fishing gear, and enough promise of quiet to make up for months of chaos. Lake Pine was supposed to be our place of peace. Tall pines, cool air off the water, a dock big enough for 2 chairs, and no responsibilities. We drove up humming along to old country songs, ready to reset. We didn't even get the groceries inside before the trouble began. Rachel was unloading the bags, humming some tune she'd been stuck on all week, when the crunch of gravel made us both look up. A white Lexus eased itself into our driveway like it owned the place. The door opened, and out stepped the kind of woman you could smell before she spoke, perfume thick enough to stun wildlife, oversized sunglasses, and a knit sweater in a shade that practically screamed HOA budget surplus. Karen. She held a clipboard the way a swordsman holds a blade, like she'd been waiting for a fight. She didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't even nod. She marched straight past us and began walking the perimeter of our cabin, scribbling notes like an appraiser who'd already decided everything was wrong. Rachel tried to be friendly. "Hi there, can we help you?" Karen didn't stop writing. "We've had unauthorized activity on this parcel. Need to confirm your status. Are you renters?" Rachel set down the paper towels and wiped her hands on her jeans. "No, we own this place." Karen finally looked up, squinting like she'd just smelled a lie. "I don't recognize you." I stepped beside Rachel. "We were here last spring." "My name's Dean. This is my wife, Rachel." Karen's eyebrows climbed her forehead. "I'm the HOA president," she announced, as if we might kneel. "We require formal occupancy notices through the community portal. Did you submit one? Let me tell you something about that portal. It was a broken WordPress site built sometime during the Jurassic era. The login form crashed if you breathed too hard. The calendar plugin displayed random dates from 2018. Half the pages had titles like Draft Copy, 3, Final. This was the system Karen spoke of like it was NASA Mission Control. Rachel smiled politely. We weren't informed that was required for owners. Karen clicked her pen aggressively. "Regardless, I don't see your name on the ownership record." That was the moment everything clicked. I purchased the cabin under my LLC because it made the tax situation cleaner, which meant my name was on the title, not Rachel's. Not because she wasn't my partner in everything, it was just one of those bureaucratic choices that made sense on paper. But to Karen, it was ammunition. Her lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. She produced a slip of paper printed in God Help Us, Comic Sans. "This is a warning. You must vacate until your residency can be verified." Rachel took the slip, gave it a single glance, and handed it back. "No thanks. I don't take orders from you." Karen looked genuinely offended that the sun hadn't darkened in response. From that moment on, she declared war. The next morning, our yard violated the natural debris limit, which apparently meant 3 pine cones had fallen in the night. Then came the note taped to the door about excessive porch occupancy, which was just Rachel drinking coffee on the porch swing. I wish I were joking. She actually invented the term. She probably copyrighted it. The masterpiece, however, arrived 2 days later. A formal complaint accusing Rachel of unauthorized cohabitation, taped to our mailbox with packing tape and sealed with what, I swear, looked like a lipstick imprint. Rachel read it aloud in a deadpan voice. To whom it may concern, the unidentified female on premises must depart within 48 hours or face removal via local enforcement. I burst out laughing. Rachel didn't. This woman won't stop, she said quietly. She's going to push until she feels powerful. She was right. Karen wasn't the type to back down. She wasn't even the type to reflect. She was the type to double down until she either got her way or set something on fire, metaphorically or otherwise. By the morning Karen finally made the 911 call, we were more amused than shocked. Annoyed, sure, but surprised? Not even close. What we didn't know then, standing in our cabin kitchen, looking at each other over a cup of coffee and a phone call dripping with rookie terror, was just how far Karen was willing to go, or how spectacularly her little crusade would backfire. Because she wasn't trying to evict just anyone. She was trying to evict Commander Rachel Merritt, head of the entire state police force, woman with a direct line to the governor and more legal firepower in her phone than the HOA had in its entire archive. Karen had poked a dragon, and she had no idea the firestorm that was about to roll straight toward her. When the patrol cars finally rolled up our dirt road that morning, I was standing at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching the blue lights flicker between the trees like confused fireflies. The officers stepped out slowly, as if approaching a suspicious raccoon rather than a supposed home intruder. One read from a notepad he clearly didn't trust. The other kept glancing from the house to his partner, silently asking, "Are we sure we're at the right place?" Rachel opened the door before they even knocked. She didn't slam it open or stride out like some action hero. She just stepped into the doorway with a calm expression, the kind of steady, measured calm that scares people more than shouting ever could. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said. "I understand you're here to remove me from my own cabin." The younger officer blinked, like his brain had just blue-screened. "Ma'am, we received a 911 report claiming a trespass in progress. The complainant identified you by name." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "And yet here I am, in my pajamas, making breakfast." The officer fumbled for words, settling on the safest phrase available to him. "May we come in?" "Of course." Rachel stepped aside and gestured them inside like she'd been hosting residents for brunch instead of dealing with an eviction attempt. I stayed near the hallway, watching the poor guys struggle to reconcile the ridiculous call they'd been sent to handle with the very normal cabin they were standing in. One of them scanned the room out of habit, the fishing rods by the door, the grocery bags still on the counter, the half-sliced apple Rachel had abandoned when the call came in. Nothing looked remotely criminal. Then the younger officer flipped to a second page on his notepad. The complainant stated that you refused to vacate when told you were not an authorized occupant. Rachel let out a soft breath, just enough to signal annoyance without being disrespectful. "Officer, I'm the co-owner of this property in every meaningful sense except paperwork technicalities. My husband purchased the cabin under an LLC, which lists only his name. But I live here, I pay for it, and I certainly didn't break in." The older officer nodded slowly, trying to hide the fact that he already suspected this was a load of HOA nonsense wrapped in legal jargon. "Do you have proof of affiliation with the owner?" he asked gently. Without missing a beat, Rachel picked up her phone from the counter and tapped a few times. "Here's our marriage certificate. Here's the LLC listing with my name as co-executive. And here," she swiped again, "is a photo of me unlocking the cabin with the key I've had since the day we bought it." The officers leaned in, examining the documentation. The younger one opened his mouth to say something, then stopped, squinted, and looked back at Rachel. "Ma'am, I just want to confirm something. Your name is Rachel Merritt?" "Yes," she said. He swallowed. "As in, Commander Merritt?" Rachel gave a polite nod. The two officers straightened so fast I could almost hear their vertebrae snap into alignment. The older one removed his hat. The younger one looked like he might spontaneously combust from embarrassment. "Commander, ma'am, he said shakily. We didn't realize we weren't informed. Rachel held up a hand. Relax. You're just doing your job, and frankly I appreciate that you responded professionally, but I want something very clear on record. She picked up the remote and tapped the security feed onto the TV. Grainy footage appeared, Karen creeping around our cabin 2 days earlier, photographing our recycling bin like she was gathering intel for a garbage-based sting operation. Then another clip, Karen with a tape measure, stretching it across our firewood stack while mumbling to herself, and another her, stepping onto the porch uninvited, seemingly measuring the distance between the welcome mat and the door frame. If Karen ever turned to crime, she'd have one hell of a head start on the surveillance skills. The older officer let out a long sigh. That's trespassing, Rachel nodded, and harassment, and misuse of emergency services if she called 911 claiming I was an intruder. That's exactly what she did, the younger one admitted. She said you were refusing to leave the property. Rachel crossed her arms. I was refusing to leave my breakfast. The officers looked at each other, silently agreeing they'd been dragged into a circus. The older one finally said, Commander, if you want to file charges— Not yet, Rachel interrupted, but I do want a formal log of every call made to dispatch involving this residence from this point forward. Of course, he said quickly, pulling out a form. As they filled it out, I watched Rachel. Not angry, not shaken, just coldly focused like someone beginning to assemble a puzzle while already knowing exactly how it ends. When the officers left, they apologized 3 separate times. The younger one even asked if we wanted extra patrols, which Rachel politely declined. I don't need protection, she said. I need documentation. After they stepped off the porch, I closed the door behind them and leaned against it. Well, I said, that went better than expected. Rachel gave a humorless little smile. Karen thinks this is a power struggle between her and a woman she believes doesn't belong here. She doesn't understand that she just put herself on a collision course with actual law. I nodded, but my stomach tightened. Because the 911 call wasn't the end, it was the beginning. That evening, long after the officers were gone and the sun dipped behind the pines, I sat with Rachel on the porch. The sky was cooling into that soft blue that only Lake Town seemed to master. The water was calm. The cicadas were humming. Everything looked peaceful, but Rachel wasn't looking at the lake. She was staring at the road. She's coming, she murmured. And she was right. Around 8 p.m., Karen's Lexus crawled past the house. Not stopping, not waving, just watching, evaluating. The way a hawk watches a mouse hole before it strikes. I caught a glimpse of her face behind the tinted window-tight jaw, narrowed eyes, lips pressed into a line that could slice stone. Rachel didn't move. She didn't even blink. She's trying to gauge whether she scared me, she said softly. She wants to know if calling 911 rattled me. Did it? I asked. Rachel shook her head. No, but it told me something important. What's that? She's escalating. And she won't stop until something burns. I exhaled slowly. Then what do we do? Rachel finally turned to me, the porch light catching in her eyes like a spark. We let her escalate, she said. We let her climb as high as she wants. Why? So she can fall from a height she'll never recover from. A chill ran through Menno, fear, not dread, but that quiet, electric feeling you get when you realize someone has already seen 10 steps ahead. Because this wasn't just a petty HOA dispute anymore. This was a woman with no power trying to challenge a woman who carried the full force of the law behind her. A woman who dismantled drug rings, exposed corrupt judges, held the entire state's law enforcement chain in the palm of her hand. And Karen? Karen had a clipboard. It was never going to be a fair fight. If you've ever lived under an HOA, you already know this truth. Once a Karen feels embarrassed, she doesn't retreat, she reloads. And the morning after the 911 fiasco, I saw just how quickly embarrassment could turn into a full-scale crusade. The day started normal enough. I was frying eggs. Rachel was finishing her morning run, her hair still damp with mist from the lake when she stepped onto the porch. But the peace didn't last. At exactly 9:17 a.m., Karen's Lexus slithered past our cabin again, slower this time. Not the usual patrolling for imagined infractions speed, no, this was a reconnaissance crawl. The kind of drive someone does when they're building a story in their head. I stood at the window with my coffee. Second pass this morning. Rachel didn't even look surprised. She's checking if the police hauled me away last night. She really thought you'd be gone? She hoped fear would do what her fake authority couldn't. Rachel walked inside, grabbed her phone, and scrolled with the kind of sharp, precise focus that tells you she's not just reading, she's assembling evidence in her mind, slotting each piece into a mental folder labeled leverage. A second later, she held the screen out to me. It was an email. Subject line in all caps. Unauthorized occupant remains on property. Urgent action required. Sent by Karen to the entire HOA board, time-stamped 7:03 a.m. Didn't take her long, Rachel murmured. The email was a masterpiece of delusion. Karen claimed Rachel had verbally threatened her, refused to grant mandatory HOA inspections, and evaded rule enforcement. She'd even attached a blurry screenshot Rachel jogging past a pine tree captioned with a red arrow and the word loitering written in what looked like Comic Sans again. I burst out laughing. Loitering? On the road we pay taxes for? Rachel didn't smile. She's serious. And the more she loses face, the more dangerous she becomes. She wasn't wrong. By noon, a new email hit our inbox. This one wasn't from Karen. It was from the HOA treasurer, Greg, an anxious man who treated accounting spreadsheets like ancient scripture. It read, "Per recent complaints and community concern, the board will hold a special session this afternoon to review possible violations. Please prepare relevant documentation. No greeting, no signature. Just pure bureaucratic dread." I looked at Rachel. "You want me to come with you?" She shook her head. "No. This isn't a showdown. Not yet. Let her dig." When we arrived at the HOA clubhouse, Rachel walked inside while I stayed in the truck. The clubhouse always reminded me of a dentist's office converted into a library for people who yell about mulch depth, sterile, beige, and humming with passive aggression. Even from the parking lot, Karen's voice leaked through the thin walls. "She refuses to comply with our standards. She isn't registered. We cannot allow instability." Instability. That was her new favorite word. Another voice, probably Greg's, spoke up. "There's no legal basis to remove her, Karen. She's married to the owner." Karen snapped back. "She's unverified. We have rules." Then Rachel's voice, calm and cutting, floated through the air. "If words could file court motions by themselves, hers would. If I may," she began. "Not only am I married to the deed owner, but I am also formally listed as co-executive on the LLC that holds the property. And though I dislike bringing this up, I am also the head of our state's law enforcement division. So, unless this HOA plans on taking this matter to a real courtroom, I suggest we stop pretending this is anything more than personal." Silence. Not a respectful silence, a terrified one. Then Greg mumbled something about systems and protocols, trying desperately to keep the peace. Karen, of course, cut him off. "She's mocking our authority," Karen squawked. Rachel's voice turned sharp enough to shave the paint off the clubhouse walls. "Karen, the only reason this hasn't gone legal is because I assumed you were capable of stopping before you embarrassed yourself further. But you've continued to escalate. You've misused HOA procedures. You've attempted to weaponize legal processes to remove a lawfully present resident based on your own bias." Stillness. Even the air held its breath. And then footsteps. The door opened, and Rachel walked back to the truck without a word. She slid into the passenger seat and buckled up, staring straight ahead. "How'd it go?" I asked. She exhaled through her nose. "They're afraid of her. Too afraid to vote, too afraid to stop her. They postponed the issue." Postponed? They want more documentation. In reality, she looked out the windshield. They're giving her rope. You think she'll hang herself with it? Rachel shook her head. "No. She'll try to drag me with her when she jumps." She wasn't exaggerating. That evening, while we sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the ridge, my phone buzzed. It was the insurance company. Someone anonymous, of course, had reported our cabin as an illegal rental property, a violation that could spike our premiums. "This woman," I muttered, rubbing my forehead. Rachel didn't react. She forwarded them the documentation instantly, and calmly, too calmly. That's how I knew she was angry. Rachel's anger was never loud, it was organized. The next morning, another notice arrived, this time from county zoning, demanding a septic inspection due to a noise complaint tied to possible misuse of utilities. Karen wasn't just throwing pebbles anymore. She was throwing bricks, and then she crossed the line. Saturday night, Rachel and I drove back from dinner in town. It was one of those quiet drives, windows cracked, pine air drifting through the truck. When we turned onto our road, everything looked normal, until we reached the cabin. Rachel froze. The front door was open, just a little, a hairline crack, just enough to feel intentional. She rushed forward. I followed, heart pounding. Inside, nothing was stolen, nothing was smashed. But someone had definitely been there. A framed photo of us face down, a drawer, the one where Rachel kept her off-duty badge pulled halfway open, a coat draped awkwardly over a chair instead of its hook. It wasn't a robbery. It was a message. Rachel pulled out her phone and spoke in a voice so measured it gave me chills. Activate incident report. Code red. Intrusion with civil escalation suspected. Secure location immediately. Her phone chirped acknowledgement. Then she turned to me. She crossed the line. The next morning didn't bring police sirens or apologies from the HOA. It brought a drone. A small black quadcopter hovered outside our second-floor window, staring at us with its tiny blinking red eye. Its buzzing filled the whole cabin, an insect made of malice. I pushed the curtain aside slowly. It tilted toward me like it recognized my face. Rachel didn't flinch. She sat at the dining table with her coffee, reviewing footage from the previous night's break-in like an attorney prepping a case. "We've got a new visitor," I said. She replied, taking a sip. "She's documenting us." "No, she's baiting us." I frowned. "You think she wants you to confront her? Give her something to use?" "She's desperate," Rachel said, eyes still on her screen, "and desperation makes people stupid." She forwarded the footage to several agencies with the kind of ease most people use when forwarding memes. Then she made a phone call, a short, surgical one. "Yes, I'd like to open a formal investigation into unauthorized access and harassment by a private HOA member using stolen emergency credentials." Stolen emergency credentials. She had proof. Karen wasn't just meddling. She'd used a restricted access master key, the kind HOAs were supposed to safeguard like gold toe get into our house. And just like that, everything shifted. "Time to lay a trap," Rachel murmured, sliding her phone aside. "She wants escalation? Let's give her something she can't climb out of." I didn't know what she meant yet, but I knew Karen was about to learn the difference between playground power and real authority. Because Rachel wasn't out for revenge, she was out for accountability. And she was done holding back. The thing about Rachel, something Karen never understood, is that she doesn't rush. She doesn't flail. She doesn't react emotionally, even when someone breaks into our home or circles it with surveillance drones like a vulture looking for weak spots. When Rachel moves, she moves with intent. Every step measured. Every action preloaded with purpose. And Karen, in her delusion, thought she was the one playing chess. The morning after the drone incident, I found Rachel at the dining table, surrounded by documents, screens, and a steaming mug of black coffee. She was reviewing the footage from the break-in with the intensity of someone studying the final piece of a puzzle she'd already begun assembling in her mind days ago. "She's escalating faster than I expected," Rachel murmured without looking up. "Which part?" I asked. "The break-in? The drone? The insurance fraud?" "All of it," she said. "People like her always escalate when their authority is challenged. But breaking into a state official's home?" She paused the video on a blurry figure, Karen's sweater, unmistakable in its HOA-approved pastel. "That tells me she thinks she's untouchable." I rubbed my face. "So what now?" Rachel tapped the screen once. Now I stopped letting her dictate the pace. Before I could ask what that meant, a car door slammed outside, then another. I walked to the window and peeked out just in time to see Karen marching down our walkway like she owned every inch of gravel beneath her expensive flats. And she wasn't alone. Trailing her was a young man in a cheap suit carrying a leather briefcase so oversized it swallowed half his torso. He looked like the kind of lawyer who had passed the bar on his 6th attempt, only to immediately specialize in giving terrible advice. Karen pounded on the door without hesitation. Rachel stood, smoothing the front of her shirt. "Let's do this," she said, opening the door with a smile that should have been installed in a museum under weapons of quiet destruction. Karen didn't smile back. She thrust her hand dramatically toward the lawyer. "Tell her," she ordered. The young man stepped forward, clearing his throat with the confidence of a houseplant. "Ma'am, I'm Stephen, representing the HOA's legal advisory team. We've drawn up a cease and desist order regarding your conduct and unauthorized presence within the HOA jurisdiction. If you refuse to comply. Rachel lifted one hand, barely an inch. Stephen froze mid-sentence. Stephen, she said quietly, let me stop you right there. Even I took a tiny step back. She continued, first, I have already filed complaints with several state agencies regarding Karen's behavior. Complaints that include criminal trespass, unlawful surveillance, and misuse of emergency entry keys. She nodded toward the drone controller in Stephen's other hand, the one Karen had clearly shoved at him like evidence. Second, this property falls outside the enforcement reach of the HOA bylaws due to its LLC corporate structure and jurisdictional classification. I verified that with county records this morning. Stephen's expression creased. Karen's jaw clenched. And finally, Rachel stepped forward, her voice calm enough to chill the air. I'm not just a resident. I am Commander Rachel Merritt, director of this state's law enforcement division. So unless you have a court order signed by a judge, what you're holding is just stationary with ambition. Stephen swallowed like he was trying to digest a boulder. Karen, of course, chose the worst possible moment to double down. Your position is irrelevant, she snapped. You represent a threat to community order. You don't respect our authority. Rachel turned her head just slightly. Authority comes from law, Karen, not from clipboards. The air went quiet. Then Rachel held out her palm. The drone controller, she said. Karen blinked. What? Now. Every ounce of color drained from Karen's face. She hesitated, then slowly, very slowly pulled the black controller from her purse. Rachel took it, flipped the switch, and powered it down with the finality of a guillotine dropping. Unauthorized surveillance device neutralized, Rachel said softly. Stephen looked like he wanted to drop into a hole and never return. Karen opened her mouth, closed it, then grabbed Stephen's sleeve and practically dragged him back to her Lexus, muttering something about community safety protocols. When they were finally gone, I let out the breath I'd been holding. Was that legal? I asked. Rachel smirked. Legal enough, and satisfying, but the storm wasn't done growing. Around sunset, when the lake turned gold and the pines cast long shadows, Rachel's phone rang. She checked the caller ID and raised an eyebrow. It's Judge Halford. I froze. Halford wasn't your average judge. He'd known Rachel for years, served on panels with her, lost money to her in poker nights. Rachel answered. Halford? His voice was clipped, irritated. Rachel, I've got something unusual on my desk. A petition filed for an emergency injunction requesting removal of a potentially unstable, non-registered individual from a residential neighborhood for safety concerns. Rachel's stare sharpened. And this names me. It names you, Halford confirmed. Filed by Karen. No attorney, self-submitted. And Rachel, he sighed heavily. It's bad. Not legally bad. Emotionally unhinged bad. Full of copied HOA language and exaggerated claims. Reads like a high school essay written by someone who thinks crime documentaries make them a prosecutor. Will it move forward? Rachel asked. Absolutely not. I'm flagging it. But Rachel, she's not just being petty anymore. She's going nuclear. Rachel thanked him and hung up. She didn't speak for a moment. She just watched the lake sleep beneath the rising moon. She's cornered, Rachel said finally, and cornered people lash out. I didn't say what I was thinking, didn't need to. The evening air said it for me. This was no longer a neighborhood scuffle. Karen had decided to fight a war she didn't understand, and Rachel had just decided to finish it. But the next morning brought the biggest escalation yet. Just past 7 a.m., 2 dark SUVs rolled up our road. Sleek, quiet, marked with the insignia of the State Ethics and Law Review Divisiona group that didn't show up unless someone had messed up on a governmental scale. 2 investigators stepped out, one tall and stone-faced, the other carrying a briefcase that practically glowed with legal instruction manuals. These weren't local officers responding to noise complaints. These were the people who showed up to dismantle corruption. Commander Merritt? The tall one asked. Rachel stepped forward. Yes. We're initiating a formal inquiry into community leadership abuse, false filings, and possible misuse of enforcement powers by a member of your neighborhood HOA. He handed Rachel a document. We'd like to interview you and your husband. We'll also be issuing a notice to the HOA board later today. My jaw nearly hit the porch. Karen wanted to escalate? Congratulations. She'd just invited the Department of Doom. Rachel scanned the documents. Thank you. I'll cooperate fully. The investigators nodded and left. I stared at Rachel. So, this is happening. She finally smiled, but not the amused smile from earlier days. This one was colder, sharper. A smile that said she had just stopped holding back. "Yes," she said. "It is." An hour later, 6 emails from panicked HOA board members flooded our inbox. 3 apologized for premature actions. 2 asked for clarification. O'Night had to be Karen's closest ally, insisted Rachel had misled the investigators. Rachel ignored every one of them. Instead, she stood, stretched her shoulders like she was gearing up for a marathon, and said, "Time to let the system do what it should have done from the start." The next days would reveal just how deeply Karen had tangled herself in her own web and how Rachel would pull every thread until the whole thing collapsed. But in that moment, standing on our porch under the rising sun, watching black SUVs disappear into the trees, I realized something important. Karen wasn't fighting Rachel anymore. She was fighting the truth. And the truth had a badge, a title, and an entire state behind her. The thing about sudden peace is that it never really means peace. Sometimes it's just the air holding its breath before the next storm cracks the sky open, and for the next 24 hours, Lake Pine Estates held its breath. Rachel and I spent the morning answering investigator questions, timeline reviews, document verification, copies of security footage. The state ethics team worked like machines, cross-checking everything Rachel handed them with their own databases. By lunch, they already had a working picture of what had happened. By dinner, they had enough to issue a preliminary finding of probable misconduct by HOA leadership. Karen didn't know it yet, but her empire of pettiness was already smoldering. But if Rachel was ice, Karen was gasoline. And gasoline reacts badly when it feels cornered. That night, around 8 p.m., Rachel and I stepped onto the porch with mugs of tea, hoping for a rare minute of calm. The lake reflected the moon like polished steel. The pines were whispering in the breeze. For a moment, it almost felt like the cabin had returned to what it was supposed to be: quiet, safe, ours. Then we saw the Lexus. It was parked half a block down, engine running, headlights off, pointed directly at our home like a predator watching prey. Karen sat inside, phone pressed to her ear, face lit by its glow, the kind of tight, strained expression someone wears when they're scrambling for an escape route. "She's planning something," Rachel murmured, barely above a whisper. "More complaints?" I asked. Rachel shook her head. "Not complaints. Strategy." I watched Karen's SUV for another moment. "You were right. I usually am," she replied, taking a sip of tea. "Next time she won't call local police. She'll try to escalate to something bigger." I glanced sideways. "So what do we do?" "We let her," Rachel said. "The higher she climbs, the harder she falls." Her voice didn't carry anger, just certainty. But I could feel it in the air, the tension kneading the breeze, the silence holding itself too straight, like the whole forest was bracing, and it didn't take long. By the next morning, Karen had activated a new tactic: bureaucracy warfare. We woke to an inbox full of HOA board emails. Karen had drafted a complaint accusing Rachel of refusing inspection, intimidating the HOA president, violating occupancy codes, and my personal favorite, creating a hostile environmental presence. I think she meant environment, but the typo somehow made it worse. The board, terrified of being caught ignoring her, again, scheduled yet another emergency session. Rachel didn't even sigh. "She's trying to bury me in paperwork." I skimmed the email. "Is that possible? For normal people? Yes. For me?" Rachel gave a dry smile. "Not a chance." She attended the meeting alone again. This time I offered to come twice. She refused twice. "She wants to isolate me," Rachel said. "Let her think she has." I watched her walk into the clubhouse, the same beige, soul-sucking building where they held potlucks and petty grievances, with equal seriousness, and I waited. From the truck, I could hear the muffled chaos. Karen's voice rose like a siren. She ignored the required occupancy check. She refused to let me into the property. She displayed aggression. Someone cut her off. The treasurer, maybe. We saw no aggression. Karen snapped. "She's not registered." Then silence. A long one. Rachel's voice broke it, soft, calm, precise. "Not only am I registered with the Secretary of State as co-executive of the LLC that owns the property," she said, "but I also manage the operational budget for the law enforcement department that responds to your calls." A stunned pause followed. Then Rachel continued, voice sharp as winter. And if this HOA continues to misuse procedure to target lawful residents based on personal bias, I will file a state investigation into procedural abuse before dinner. You could hear a mouse cry in that room. When Rachel emerged 20 minutes later, her expression was unreadable. She walked back to the truck, slid in, and buckled up. "Well?" I asked. "They're terrified of her," she said. "They postponed everything again." "Postponed? They want additional documentation." Rachel snorted softly. "In HOA language that means, we're scared to confront Karen, so we'll let her keep going until someone else stops her." "Which means," I pressed. Rachel looked straight ahead. "Which means Karen is going to get worse." And she did. That evening I got a call from our insurance provider. Someone had anonymously reported our cabin as an illegal vacation rental. If we couldn't prove residency within 72 hours, our rate would skyrocket. I nearly choked. "She's going after our insurance now?" Rachel handled it calmly, forwarding documents before the representative even finished speaking, but I could see it in her shoulders, the toll of constant harassment, even on someone as steady as Rachel. It didn't end there. The next day, zoning inspectors emailed. A noise complaint tied to possible septic malfunction had triggered a review request. Karen wasn't just poking at us, she was weaponizing every system she could reach. But Karen's biggest mistake came that weekend. We returned from dinner in town just after dark. Rachel stepped onto the porch first, keys in hand, and stopped. The door was open, barely, a sliver. Like someone hadn't closed it properly or wanted it to look that way. Rachel rushed inside. I followed, heart pounding. Nothing was stolen, but everything was wrong. A framed photo of us face down. A kitchen drawer pulled halfway open, the drawer with her off-duty badge disturbed. It wasn't burglary, it was messaging. Rachel didn't speak. She just lifted her phone, tapped once, and said, "Activate incident report, code red. Intrusion, civil escalation suspected." Her voice was cold steel. Then she turned to me. She crossed the line. The next morning, retaliation arrived in the form of a drone. It hovered 6 feet from our second-floor window, camera blinking red, recording everything with malicious curiosity. I yanked the curtain aside. The drone tilted its lens toward me like an eye widening in interest. Rachel didn't even look up. "She's documenting us," I told her. "No, she's baiting." "Baiting what?" "An emotional reaction." Rachel's voice was smooth but tight. "If she gets footage of me yelling or reacting aggressively, she'll use it to justify another call." I stared at the drone. "She's that strategic?" "No," Rachel said. "She's desperate, and desperation mimics strategy." Rachel calmly forwarded the home intrusion footage to 3 different oversight boards, then picked up her phone again. "Yes," she said when someone answered. "I'd like to open a formal investigation into unauthorized use of HOA emergency keys and harassment by a board member." She wasn't angry, she wasn't frustrated, she was deliberate. It was like watching someone assemble a missile. By noon, Rachel had filed 6 separate complaints, each tied to a statute, each attached with evidence, each written like a courtroom brief. "Let's see how she likes playing offense," Rachel said, when she's suddenly the defendant. As if summoned by those words, Karen appeared again an hour later, this time, with a lawyer who looked like he had been born nervous. What happened on that porch would change everything. But even then, even as Karen marched toward us with her legal fledgling clutching a cease and desist letter, I realized something. Karen wasn't trying to enforce rules. She was trying to survive the consequences of her own madness. And Rachel? Rachel was about to let the consequences catch up. Karen may have arrived with some flimsy piece of paper clutched in her sweaty hand, but she strutted up our porch like she'd just served us an eviction notice from the Supreme Court. Her lawyer, if you could call him, that looked like he'd been hired from a discount aisle. Nervous, pale, gripping his briefcase like it contained the last crumbs of his dignity. Karen didn't wait to be invited. She marched right up and jabbed a finger toward Rachel. "This is her," she declared triumphantly to the trembling young man beside her. The woman impersonating a resident, refusing board inspection, threatening leadership. "Tell her what the consequences are." He cleared his throat like a man preparing to drown. "Ma'am, I'm Stephen, representing the HOA's advisory legal team. We've prepared a cease and desist order regarding your conduct and unauthorized presence within this jurisdiction. If you fail to comply..." Rachel raised her hand, not high, not threatening, just a small gesture. Stephen froze mid-sentence. "Stephen," she said gently, "do you know who I am?" His eyes darted to Karen, who nodded with the frantic enthusiasm of someone trying to telepathically transmit lies. "She's a non-compliant resident," Karen hissed. Rachel ignored her. "I'm Commander Rachel Merritt, Director of the State Police Force. I oversee statewide law enforcement operations. And whether you realize it or not, you are about 30 seconds from becoming a footnote in a disciplinary report." Stephen's eyes widened so far I thought they might roll off the porch. He instantly stepped back as though distance could protect him from the damage already done. "But Karen?" Karen doubled down. "Her title doesn't matter," she snapped. "This is a community. I am the president of this HOA, and she is a threat to the integrity of this neighborhood." Rachel turned, slowly, like a storm shifting its gaze. "A threat, Karen? The only person creating danger here is the one stalking residents, breaking into homes, and flying drones outside bedroom windows." "I did no such thing," Karen sputtered. Rachel tapped her phone. The video played instantly, the drone hovering, recording. Then the footage from the night before the door ajar, the rummaged drawers, and finally, the earlier clips of Karen measuring our firewood, photographing our trash, wandering across our porch with a tape measure like she was preparing for a forensic analysis of pine needles. Stephen whispered, "Oh no," under his breath. "Give me the drone controller," Rachel said. Karen blinked, as if she'd just been asked for one of her kidneys. "Excuse me?" "The controller," Rachel repeated. "Now." Karen looked like she might explode. But she must have sensed the ground shifting beneath her, because she reached into her oversized Persith, kind only HOA royalty carry and slowly produced the small black controller. Her hands trembled as she placed it in Rachel's palm. Rachel powered it off with a soft click. "Unauthorized surveillance device neutralized," she said calmly. Karen's face turned a fascinating shade somewhere between panic and fury. She spun around and marched back to her SUV so stiffly she looked like a malfunctioning animatronic. Stephen trailed behind, whispering frantic apologies into the air. When they finally sped off, gravel spraying like confetti at a funeral, I turned to Rachel. "Was any of that legal?" She sipped her coffee. "Legal enough," she said with a shrug. "Besides, the law tends to sympathize with the people who weren't flying espionage drones at dawn." But the universe wasn't done delivering surprises. That same evening, as Rachel washed dishes and I pretended to organize mail, her phone buzzed again. She dried her hands on a towel, glanced at the caller ID, and muttered, "Of course." It was Judge Halford, she answered. "Evening, Halford." His voice came through tight and clipped, like a man already exhausted by what he had in front of him. "Rachel, are you sitting down?" "I'm standing," she replied. "Well, brace yourself. I just received an emergency injunction request. It requests the removal of a potentially unstable individual from a residential community." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Unstable?" "It names you," Halford confirmed. "Filed pro se by a woman named," he shuffled papers, "Karen Pinebrook." Rachel closed her eyes. "Of course it does. This filing is," "Rachel, it's absurd. A combination of plagiarized legal terms, fabricated HOA regulations, and paragraphs that read like someone dictated them while pacing in a rage. I'm rejecting it immediately, but you should know your HOA president is escalating." Rachel thanked him, hung up, and stared out the cabin window for a long moment. The trees swayed gently under the moonlight, but everything felt unnaturally still. "She's not trying to win anymore," Rachel finally said. "She's trying to survive." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means she's burning every bridge she has left." And she was right, because the next morning delivered consequences that even Karen couldn't outrun. 2 black SUVs rolled down our road in quiet formation, the kind of vehicles that don't need sirens to announce authority. These belonged to the State Ethics and Law Review Division, and they didn't show up unless someone's misconduct had crossed from petty to dangerous. 2 investigators stepped out, crisp suits, unblinking professionalism. "Commander Merritt," the taller one said. Rachel met them on the porch. "Yes?" "We're initiating a formal inquiry into allegations of community leadership abuse, false legal filings, and misuse of emergency service protocols." He handed Rachel a document. "We'd like to interview you and your husband. A notice will be issued to the HOA board today." I've never seen Rachel smile like that. Not smug, not triumphant, just calm, certain, justified. "Of course," she said, We'll cooperate fully. And just like that, the crack in Karen's throne became a canyon. News spreads faster than wildfire in HOA territories. By noon, the entire board was in meltdown, sending frantic emails. We had no idea the situation was this severe, please advise. We want to cooperate fully. Should we suspend Karen? Please understand we never supported her actions. All lies, every last one, but desperation makes cowards poetic. Karen, meanwhile, sent a single email. This is a misunderstanding. I will resolve it personally. Rachel read it and laughed, not mockingly, just knowingly. She thinks this is still about her authority, she said. She doesn't understand it's out of her hands now. And she was right. It was out of everyone's hands except the state investigators now. By evening, a formal suspension notice was taped to Karen's door. By nightfall, the board announced an emergency review session without her. For the first time since we arrived at Lake Pine Estates, the air felt clear. Not peaceful, not yet, but clear. Like the forest, the lake, even the breeze had been waiting for someone to finally call Karen's bluff, but Rachel wasn't celebrating. She stood on the porch, watching the road disappear into the shadows. This isn't over, she said quietly. How can you tell? I asked. She didn't look away from the tree line. Because people like Karen never go quietly, Rachel said. They don't know how, and she was right again. Because the next phase of Karen's fight would be darker, quieter, and far more dangerous than anything she'd done before. The morning after Karen was officially suspended from the HOA board should have felt like victory. Birds were singing, the lake looked like glass, our porch smelled like fresh coffee instead of stress, but peace after a battle is deceptive. It's not the end, it's the inhale before the next blow. Rachel was already awake when I stepped into the kitchen. She sat at the table with her tablet, scrolling through emails from the ethics investigators. I could tell by the small crease between her eyebrows that something had already shifted. What now? I asked, pouring myself coffee. She rotated the tablet toward me. Karen's in denial. She's emailing the board claiming all of this is a political conspiracy. Political? I blinked. Does she think you're running for governor? She thinks everything that challenges her authority is part of a plot, Rachel said, and she's not stopping just because she got suspended. She was right because by noon, the retaliation began. It started subtly. A package was left at our mailbox. No return address, no postage, no carrier label. Just a plain brown box with our cabin's number scribbled in red ink that made my skin crawl. Inside was a bird feeder, an empty one, with a tiny folded note tucked underneath it. You might have won the board, but you don't control me. I'm everywhere. I handed it to Rachel like it was radioactive. She studied the handwriting calmly. She's testing boundaries, seeing if she can scare us off balance. But with bird feeders? It's symbolic, Rachel said. Karen thinks she's subtle. I wanted to laugh, but the air in the cabin felt heavier than humor could cut through. We didn't have to wait long for the next package. Then, the next. Within 3 days, 10 parcels had arrived. Gardening gloves, a hose nozzle, a half-bent wind chime, a packet of seeds, all useless, all untraceable, all intentionally unsettling. But package number 10, that one changed everything. It looked identical to the others. Same sloppy handwriting, same suspicious lack of postage. But when Rachel opened it, she froze. Inside was a cheap notebook. Inside the notebook were pages of printed accusation, emails, fabricated spreadsheets showing fake financial crimes, false allegations of tax evasion, and screenshots from unknown accounts. At the end of the packet was a single page. You're not the only target. Then we heard a knock. It was Vince's quiet, soft-spoken neighbor from 2 houses down. A gentle man who kept to himself, ran his accounting business out of his basement, and had a peaceable air about him. But now he stood on our porch pale as paste, shaking so hard the paper in his hand trembled like leaves in a storm. Rachel, he whispered, voice cracking. 2 got this. He held out an email. Someone sent this to 3 of my clients. Rachel took the paper and silently read it. I read over her shoulder. It was a detailed accusation claiming Vince had been embezzling funds and falsifying tax documents. It included fake spreadsheets obvious to anyone who knew accounting, but terrifying to his clients. She's expanding, Rachel murmured, trying to destabilize the people around us. Why me? Vince choked. What did I do? Rachel put a hand on his shoulder. You exist. That's all it takes for people like her. She's trying to isolate us, make others fearful, turn everything into chaos. Vince swallowed hard. What do I do? You report it, Rachel said. Now. Within minutes, she was on the phone with the state cybercrimes unit. I had never seen a man look so relieved to simply not be alone, but I also saw the fear in his eyes. Because no matter what Rachel was doing to stop Karen, there was damage being done along the way. It wasn't just an HOA problem anymore. It was a contagion. That night, Rachel sat at the table staring at her files, her laptop, the evidence, the mountain of harassment she was slowly assembling into a legal weapon. The only light in the cabin came from the screens. You're quiet, I said softly. She didn't look up. She's shifting tactics. How so? She's not hiding behind bylaws anymore, Rachel said. She's gone feral. She's using fear now. Fear spreads faster than rules. I sat across from her. How do you fight someone who hides in the shadows? Rachel finally looked at me, eyes glinting with that familiar, steady fire. You take away the shadows. The next afternoon she did exactly that. She called for a meeting, not an HOA meeting, not a vote, not a formal process, a gathering, at the old boat dock. Just neighbors, no titles, no agendas, no committees. Word spread fast. 20 people came. They brought folding chairs and thermoses, whispering in clusters until Rachel stepped up onto the old dock steps. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She didn't perform. She simply spoke the truth. Calmly, plainly, thoroughly, she laid out everything Karen had done, not just to us, but to others. The false complaints, the intimidation, the break-in, the drone, the fake financial accusations targeting Vince, the misuse of emergency access keys, the 911 call, the attempts to weaponize county systems. She did not embellish, she did not dramatize. She just laid out the facts until the truth itself felt like a force pressing down on everyone present. You could hear a pin drop. Then Rachel said something I will never forget. It's not enough to remove someone from power, she said, scanning each face. We have to replace them with people who won't become the same thing. This community doesn't need enforcers. It needs guardians, protectors, people who look out for one another instead of policing one another. The question isn't who leads next. The question is, who will make sure no one like Karen ever rises again? Silence. Then heads nodding. Then voices agreeing. Then voices rising, not in anger, but in unity. It was the first time the community had truly seen the bigger picture, the rot under the rules, the cracks in the system Karen had exploited. By the next morning, a petition was circulating, not to punish Karen, not to exile her, but to dismantle the entire HOA leadership structure and rebuild it from the ground up with legal oversight, term limits, transparent rules, an ethics committee, and a community-first approach. 70 signatures came in the first day. The vote was scheduled for Monday. Karen didn't show, but everyone knew she was watching. The vote passed by a landslide. Every board member except Greg resigned immediately. A new charter drafting committee was established that same evening. Rachel was asked to chair it. She declined. I'm not here to lead, she said. I'm here to prevent. And she meant it. For the first time since the nightmare began, the community felt light. People laughed again. Kids rode bikes. Vince stopped shaking. Linda, the neighbor with binoculars, used them for bird watching instead of spying. The air smelled like pine instead of tension. But peace is deceptive. Because the next morning before dawn, an envelope appeared in our mailbox. White, thin, no return address. The handwriting on the front tried to look neat. Failed miserably. It slanted like someone writing in anger. Rachel opened it. Inside was a single typed line. I never left. The handwriting on the envelope? Same red ink as the bird feeder note. Rachel didn't speak. She just slid the letter into a plastic evidence sleeve and went straight to her office. Within 10 minutes she had made 2 phone calls, one to reopen the state harassment case, the other to check statewide filings for alterations in HOA registrations. What she found made my stomach twist. 20 minutes from Lake Pine Estates, a new homeowners group had been submitted for HOA status. A 9-home development, tiny, newly built. It had 1 registered agent. Cassandra R. Keene. Karen's full name was Karen Cassandra Pinebrook. She'd changed the order, adjusted 1 name, used the middle initial. She wasn't trying to escape, she was trying to start over. somewhere else, somewhere new, somewhere she thought she could rise again. And at that moment, watching Rachel read the filing, I realized something chilling. Karen didn't need to be president to cause damage. She just needed a place to build a throne. When Rachel found the filing for the new homeowners group, the tiny 9-home development tucked 20 minutes from us, she didn't slam her laptop shut. She didn't curse. She didn't even blink. She just stared at the name, Cassandra R. Keene, a recycled identity, a rearranged signature, a loophole masquerading as reinvention. "Karen," she murmured, voice flat as stone, "you clever, desperate little tyrant." I leaned over her shoulder. "She's starting a new HOA?" "No," Rachel said. "She's trying to start a new kingdom." "What do we do?" Rachel clicked her pen once, just once. It was the sound she made when she transitioned from thinking to strategizing. And if Karen had been anywhere near that cabin at that moment, she would have felt the temperature drop. "We make sure she never gets the crown again." She gathered her files, her tablet, and the evidence binder she'd meticulously built, the one that now weighed as much metaphorically as it did physically. "Come on," she said, "we're taking a drive." The sun was sinking by the time we reached the new development. The road snaked along the western ridge before it opened into a half-completed cul-de-sac with freshly poured driveways, crisp house frames, and contractors hauling plywood under the fading evening light. And standing in the middle of it, wearing a crisp white blouse, pencil skirt, sunglasses, and her trademark sense of undeserved authority, was Karenine. Now she looked different, sharper, harder. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, her clipboard gleamed like a weapon, and she was giving orders to 2 bewildered contractors like she owned the place. Rachel parked the truck but didn't step out. She just watched. "Are you going to talk to her?" I asked. Rachel shook her head. "No need." As if sensing our presence, Karen turned. The moment her gaze locked onto us, she froze. Her jaw twitched. She straightened her blouse. But Rachel didn't move. She simply observed her like a field biologist watching a wounded predator attempt to claim new territory. Karen held her clipboard a little tighter, her lips pressed into a thin, fearful line. Then she spun around quickly and pretended to review a blueprint as though we didn't exist, but her body language told the truth. She knew she was exposed. We drove home in silence. Back at the cabin, Rachel worked late. She filed an injunction request, not to destroy the new homeowners group, not to punish Karen, not to take revenge, but to review Karen's application under fraud prevention protocols tied to her misconduct from Lake Pine Estates. "If she wants a throne," Rachel said, sliding documents into neat stacks, "she can try to build one, but she's not bringing her poison to anyone else." The next few days unfolded like watching a chessboard when one player doesn't realize the game is already over. The state's advisory panel cross-referenced Karen's filings. Her real name and her new name matched enough for suspicion. Her previous misconduct was officially documented. And finally, the system Rachel had helped fortify did the work for her. A statewide advisory was issued. Any individual found guilty of abuse of power in neighborhood governance will be flagged for review under any subsequent leadership filings, including those submitted under modified names or alternative legal identities. Karen's new HOA application was placed under immediate audit. Her funding froze, her title transfers halted, her leadership eligibility suspended indefinitely. She didn't know Rachel was behind it. She would just feel the world tighten around her again. The morning the audit notice arrived, Rachel didn't smile. She just nodded. Good. The system works when someone forces it to. Life at Lake Pine Estates began to settle. The new board formed. Real oversight returned. People stopped whispering. The air smelled like pine instead of stress. And for the first time in weeks, things felt almost normal. Neighbors waved again. Kids played on the gravel road. Vince started baking bread like nothing had ever happened. Even Linda's binoculars were pointed at actual birds. Rachel stepped back from the spotlight entirely. She declined every leadership role, told everyone she wasn't there to build power, only to prevent it. She helped draft clearer bylaws. She helped set term limits. She added clauses about emergency access keys, privacy rules, and penalties for abuse of power. And over time, the cabin felt alive again. But trauma doesn't vanish. It leaks. It lingers. And one ordinary afternoon, months later, that lingering fear resurfaced. I went out to grab the Mila simple habit that no longer made my stomach twist. Bills, a grocery flyer, a circular, a random coupon. Nothing strange. Then I saw it. A small white envelope, no stamp, no return address, just our address, handwritten in that same slanted, angry script. My stomach tightened. I handed it to Rachel without a word. She opened it with surgical calm. Inside was a single-page photocopy of a court document. It was the final denial of Karen's petition to regain eligibility for community leadership positions. At the bottom of the page was a bold line: "Due to verified misconduct, the applicant shall remain permanently barred from neighborhood governance roles under current statute." No note, no threat, no signature, just evidence of a door closing forever. Rachel read it once, folded it neatly, slipped it into the back of her file drawer, the drawer she hoped never to open again. I watched her closely. "How do you feel?" She exhaled slowly, not triumphant, not victorious, just clean, like we removed something toxic before it spread. We sat on the dock later that night, legs dangling over the lake's edge. The moonlight shimmered across the ripples. Crickets sang. A cool wind brushed past us, not carrying threat, just quiet. Rachel leaned against me, her shoulders eased. "She won't try again?" I asked. Rachel shook her head. "Not here. Not anywhere. Systems can be fixed. People who live on power alone can't." Silence settled comfortably between us. Then she added, "She thought she was fighting a law, a rule, a title. But she wasn't. She was fighting consequences. And those don't disappear just because you run somewhere new." For the first time in months, I believed it. For the first time in months, she wasn't ready for battle. She was ready for peace. The lake reflected the stars like a promise. And somewhere far away, Karen was finally learning that power built on fear always collapses under truth. For a while, life eased into something that almost felt normal. Not the fragile pretend normal you cling to during a storm, but the real kind. The kind that settles into your bones late at night when the only sounds are crickets, wind, and the soft creak of porch boards beneath your feet. Rachel and I rebuilt our routines piece by piece. Coffee on the porch, walks by the lake, dinner without checking windows, nights without reviewing footage, mornings without bracing for chaos. It felt like we'd reclaimed something, not just our home, but our breath. But the thing about living through someone like Karen is that you don't ever truly forget. Trauma is stubborn. It lives in memory like a shadow in your periphery. You don't always see it, but you feel when it moves. You anticipate its shape, its weight, its return, and sometimes it returns in ways you never expect. It started with the smallest thing, a smell. Pine resin. Nothing unusual. We lived in a forest. But the scent hit me differently that morning as I stepped out to the porch. Stronger, sharper, too recent, too close. Like sap had been cut open in the last few minutes. I looked around out of habit. The woods were still, the gravel road quiet. Inside, Rachel was on a video call with the new HOA charter team, calmly explaining why reasonable rule enforcement should never include surveillance drones or master keys copied in back rooms. She sounded steady strong, but the trauma lingered beneath her voice like a quiet ghost. I stood outside longer than I meant to, breathing in that resin scent. My instincts prickled. Not fear, not panic, just awareness. I had learned to trust that feeling. When Rachel finished her call, she joined me on the porch. "You're quiet," she said. "Do you smell that?" She inhaled. "Pine. What about it? It's fresh." She gave me a small smile. "We live in a forest." "Yeah, but..." The sound cut me off. A single twig snapping somewhere in the tree line. Rachel's head turned instantly toward the sound, her posture shifting from relaxed wife to commander in less than a second. She listened. Measured. Calculated. Another twig snapped closer. We both stared toward the trees, waiting for a figure to emerge. No one did. Rachel exhaled slowly. "Probably a deer." "Probably," I echoed, though my gut tensed with that old instinct something was off. We went inside. The day unfolded quietly, too quietly. The kind of quiet that presses against your ribs. By late afternoon, Rachel had settled into her office, reviewing the updated HOA draft. I cooked dinner. We ate together on the porch while the sun dipped through the trees. It was peaceful, almost soothing. Then, just as I stood to take our plates inside, Rachel froze. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. At first I heard nothing, then very faintly footsteps on gravel, slow, cautious, approaching our cabin from the road, not the woods. a direction rarely used by neighbors. Rachel stood and stepped toward the porch railing, listening with absolute focus. When she finally saw the person emerge around the bend, her posture eased but only slightly. It wasn't Karen. It was Greg, the HOA treasurer, the only board member who hadn't fled during the collapse. He held a clipboard against his chest, but he didn't walk like someone bringing paperwork. He walked like someone carrying regret. He stopped at the bottom of our porch steps. "Evening," he called gently. Rachel stepped forward. "Greg, everything all right?" He nodded hesitantly. "Yes and no. I hoped we could talk." Rachel motioned for him to come up. He shook his head. "I'll stay down here. This is more apologizing than asking." Rachel crossed her arms. I stood behind her. Greg swallowed and began. "We failed you," he said simply. "We failed this community. We let Karen run wild because we were afraid to confront her, afraid of her retaliation, afraid of the noise she created." Rachel's expression didn't soften. It didn't harden either. She just listened. Greg continued, voice trembling. "I came tonight because I've been reviewing old records. Karen filed dozens of complaints against residents. False ones, manipulated ones. She targeted people quietly, subtle for years." He shook his head. "We didn't see it, or we didn't want to." Rachel spoke quietly. "Fear protects abusers. Silence feeds them." Greg nodded. "We see that now. And we want your help. We want to rebuild. Properly this time. Legally. Safely. Fairly. Without power hoarding or intimidation. Could you help us right it? Help us make sure someone like her never rises again?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. She studied Greg, weighed him, judged the sincerity in his eyes. She sighed softly. "I'll help," she said, "but only as an advisor. I won't lead. I won't chair committees. I won't be the enforcer. That's not my role." Greg nodded gratefully. "That's more than enough." When he left, Rachel sat beside me on the porch steps. "You trust him?" I asked. "I trust his guilt," she said, "and guilt can be a powerful motivator to build something better." But the night wasn't done. An hour after Greg left, long after the sun disappeared, we got another knock. A gentle one. Hesitant. It was Vince, looking nervous, wringing his hands. "Rachel? Sorry to bother you this late." Rachel stood. "Vince, what's wrong?" He held out his phone. "I got another email." Rachel took it, read it. Her jaw tightened. It was an anonymous message claiming Vince had reported neighbors for HOA violations, including made-up infractions involving pets, fences, and noise. It was designed to turn neighbors against him, to isolate him. "She's still going?" I whispered. Rachel shook her head. "This isn't Karen." I blinked. "Who else would?" Rachel pointed to a line in the email, a formatting style, a phrase, a pattern. "This is sloppy." "Karen isn't sloppy. This is someone imitating her because they want her power vacuum filled. Someone who wants authority without accountability." Vince's face drained. "There's more than one?" Rachel didn't sugarcoat it. "Power attracts the wrong people." Vince looked like he might faint. Rachel steadied him with a hand on his shoulder. "No one is replacing her. Not on my watch." She documented the emails, forwarded them, filed another harassment report. Then she walked Vince home herself, returning 20 minutes later with that familiar calm steel in her eyes. "She tried to replicate herself," Rachel murmured when she sat back down, "or someone tried to replicate her style. Either way, this is exactly why systems matter." I nodded slowly. "Think Karen knows about this copycat?" Rachel inhaled deeply. "She's too focused on rebuilding her own empire, but she'll hear eventually." "Then what?" Rachel looked toward the tree line, the shadows deepening into black. "Then," she said softly, "we make sure she finally fades." The next week was a blur of rebuilding. Rachel helped structure the new HOA charter term limits, transparent complaint systems, mandatory multi-signature authorization for inspections, required oversight from a legal consultant. Not an empire. A framework, a safety net, a firewall. She also met privately with the ethics investigators, providing additional evidence linking Karen's attempted re-entry under a modified name to her previous misconduct. They were already drafting statewide revisions for HOA governance requirements, revisions Rachel herself had quietly inspired. It wasn't revenge, it was prevention. A month passed, the air cleared. The lake settled, the fears slowly dissolved. And then, one quiet morning, a letter arrived, not from Karen, not anonymous, not threatening. It was from the State Licensing Commission. Rachel opened it at the table. I watched her eyes track the words slowly, thoughtfully. Finally, she looked up. "It's over." "What is?" She handed me the document. It declared officially, permanent, that Karen Pinebrook, under any legal variation of her name, was banned from holding any position of authority in any HOA, co-op, neighborhood committee, community compliance team, or governance role statewide. Not suspended, not limited, banned. "I never thought I'd see something like this," I said quietly, "a system actually changing." Rachel leaned back, rubbing her thumb against her temple. "People like Karen don't just abuse power. They reveal the cracks where abuse grows, and you close the cracks." She didn't smile. "Not exactly," but her eyes softened. "I didn't fix the system," she whispered. "I just reminded it what justice looks like." That night, we sat on the dock again, the moon painted silver across the water. Rachel's head rested gently on my shoulder. "She won't come back?" I asked. Rachel shook her head. "No, not here. Not anywhere with power." "Because she's afraid?" "No," she said softly. "Because there's nowhere left for her to hide. And for the first time, not just since Karen started her crusade, but since we bought the cabin, I felt genuinely, deeply safe. Not because Karen was gone, but because Rachel had rebuilt something stronger than fear. She had rebuilt trust. The lake was quiet the night everything finally settled. No drones, no surveillance, no footsteps on gravel, just the soft hum of summer air moving through the pines and the gentle ripple of water touching the dock. I sat beside Rachel, watching her shoulders relax in a way I hadn't seen for months. Not victorious, just peaceful. The kind of peace that comes when justice is slow, steady, and final. This experience changed more than our neighborhood. It changed me. I learned that real strength isn't loud. It doesn't posture or threaten. It doesn't come from clipboards, bylaws, or the illusion of authority. Real strength is quiet, consistent, relentless in its fairness. My wife reminded me and everyone around her that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand your ground with calm certainty. And if there's a lesson here, it's this. When someone abuses power, they expect fear. What they don't expect is someone who refuses to bend. Someone who knows the truth, who protects their community, and who keeps going even when it's exhausting. If you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare or any Karen in your life, share your story below. And if you enjoyed this journey, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Justice isn't always loud, but here, it's always coming.